So in the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss the three phases to year-end processing. There's a pre-close, there's the closing, and a post-close. I'll demonstrate how to run the Create New Year function using our best practice checklist, which is in the handout section. And I will share a few tips and additional functions that are useful at year end. So what happens when you come to year end? Sage 300 allows you to post in the GL to the current fiscal year and to the previous year, but not to a future year. The Create New Year function must be performed to post in order to post to period 1 in the GL of the new fiscal year. And this function closes income and expense accounts to retained earnings, which we're not always ready to do on the very last day of the year. So what do we do at year end? Well, it's easier to consider it as a three-phase program, or sorry, three-phase process. So the first phase starts before you're actually ready to close to retained earnings. In this phase, you plan for the close and you create a new fiscal calendar, which allows you to post transactions in the subledgers for the new year while you finish the month-end transactions for period 12. In the second phase, you actually close out to retained earnings, and you do this using the GL periodic process create new year function. This function will post the entries to transfer the balances of income and expense accounts to retained earnings and create opening balances for the accounts so that you can start processing transactions in the general ledger for the new year. In the last phase, following the close, you can post your new year subledger transactions in the GL, and you post adjusting entries to the prior year if you were to have any adjusting entries for the previous year, perhaps from your accountant. Sage 300 will automatically create and post a closing entry for any journal entries posted to a prior year that affects an income or expense account. Let's look at each of these phases in detail. So when we're referring to working in period 12 and period 1 at the same time before we close out to retained earnings, we want to be able to process transactions in Sage 300 for period 1. For example, we want to be able to perhaps post and print, issue prepayments or post-dated checks for things like rent. But also, as I mentioned, we might not want to close right at the end of the month, and we still want to post in those subledgers such as accounts receivable, accounts payable, maybe order entry. And you also might want to do some prep work in the general ledger, and that would be, for example, creating a budget. So in order to do anything in the new year, we first have to add a new fiscal calendar in Common Services. And creating that fiscal calendar can be done at any time. It doesn't have any accounting implications. So creating this new fiscal calendar in Common Services just sets up the periods so that we can use Sage 300 in all the other modules except the General Ledger. Also in this period before closing to retained earnings, you're going to be working on closing your period 12. So you're going to post all transactions as you would for a regular month end. This would include printing any time-sensitive reports, reconciling to the GL for your control accounts. Also, if you are using a multi-currency system, you're going to update your exchange rates and post your revaluations. So we're doing all the steps that we would normally do at a regular month end. There might be a few additional things that you need to check at period 12 and make that it also includes all your bank reconciliations. Also, we want to take this time before it's time to close out to retained earnings to do some planning. Why don't we just push the button and go directly to create the new year and close out to retained earnings at the end of the day? Or I'm sorry, at the very end of the year, the last period. Well, what happens is when Sage does a closeout to retained earnings, it creates opening balances. And although it allows you to post back to a previous year, once you've closed, it does show that there was an adjustment to the opening balance and an adjustment to the retained earnings account. Those extra entries might prompt an auditor or an accountant to ask questions as to why if they don't understand that that's how the SAGE system works. There's no reason to rush. You can allow, like I said, the posting for the new year in all the subledgers. And if you have it come over automatically into the GL, um, Sage automatically creates an error batch, and that error batch just sits there, allowing you to um, complete all the transactions you want it to do for the year. And then after we've closed out to retained earnings, then you can post those error batches. You also want to look at planning the time of day that you're going to be doing your create new year function, closing out to retained earnings. That step requires exclusive access to Sage 300. And by exclusive access, I mean no other users can be in Sage 300 while you do that task. So some sometimes that's not convenient for everybody. You'll want to make sure that you send out a notification to everybody and have a specific time of day. And that time of day might also depend on when you're doing your backup. So we do want to do a backup before we close out to retained earnings. And that backup might be done at the end in the background by your IT department at night. So you might want to do this first thing in the morning, or you might want to say, I also need extra time because we are not going to start this at first thing in the morning. So we need extra time to allow the backup to be completed. The takeaway from this screen is that when you get close to the end of the year, so period 12, you're going to want to make sure that you create the new fiscal calendar. So we'll do a demonstration of that step, create new fiscal calendar in Sage right now. So I'm going to open up Sage 300. And this sample company that I'm using has a December year end. So I'm going to pretend that it is January of 2024. So 2040101. The message that I get here is that the session date does not exist in common services in this fiscal calendar. Do I want to continue? So you always will answer yes here. If we did nothing, we can only, from here on, you can only post transactions into the existing year, so 2023 in my scenario. But as soon as I go to Common Services, Fiscal Calendar, I can create a new calendar that will allow me to start processing transactions in the subledger for 2024. And all I need to do is go to the fiscal calendar here and say create new. So I'm pushing the plus sign here and then say add. And no journal entries were created. Nothing happened in my system. All I have is a new calendar with dates saying that I can use period 1 for any January transactions, period 2 for February, and so forth. And it will keep track of your fiscal calendar. Not everybody has a calendar year for their fiscal calendar. If you'd like, you can lock those periods. Please note that when you do year end, and create the new function, you will have to have period 1 open. And in your previous year, you will need to make sure that the closing period does not have a tick box here, and period 12 is open. So now I'm able to go in and create a transaction in accounts payable for the new year. So if I was just to go to accounts payable here and look up in AP setup, under GL integration, we see here that I'm creating entries into the GL during posting, and this one says creating a new batch. Some users say creating and posting a new batch. And I wanted to show what happens if that's your setting. So I'm going to go to AP transactions, and we'll just go to the invoice batch listing here. I'll say new. And so we can see that my batch date has a 2024 date. We'll pick vendor 1400, and we'll use the document date as January 1st, and I'll put this in for $100. So my distributed amount is going to be 113 to include the taxes. And we'll just say this is invoice 123456. So again, I'm using a January 2024 date, and I'm going to go ahead and post that entry. So it'll post successfully in my subledger. It's updated the vendor. It'll show on the vendor listing. But when I come to the general ledger and I look at my GL transactions on the batch list, we see that there's an error batch. And this is from accounts payable. And if I was to click on where it says number of errors is 1, it's going to tell me that I can't post to a future year. Cannot post to a future year. So was as expected with that setting where you're trying to automatically post your batches in the GL. And I'm going to leave that batch as is until we get to phase 3. That is our actionable items in our first pre-phase here. We've created the new fiscal calendar, and we're able to process in the subledgers for the new year. So let's go back to our PowerPoint presentation. And the next phase we're going to be discussing is actually closing out to retained earnings. And again, that function in Sage 300 is the create new year function. So for this step, we have a checklist. This checklist is part of your, excuse me, is included in the handout section. If you go into GoToMeetings in the handout section, you'll see this, our handout. So we'll follow along if you have this handout ready. And we'll start with a Sage demo here. So on our checklist, you'll notice that we have notes about things you should do before you process this function. It includes doing any imports, any of your accruals, closing out to period, your regular month end. It also reminds you that you need to create your fiscal calendar, that you should create a backup, and confirm your GL settings. You'll also want exclusive access to Sage 300. And before I start, I always like to go and make sure that nobody else has done this beforehand. And so I check that by going into GL setup, and selecting options, and I go to the posting tab. The posting tab in the middle here where I'm circling with my mouse lets me know that my current fiscal year is 2023, and I do want to advance this to 2024. While I'm here, I also make sure that it's allowing me to post to previous years and that I'm keeping at least 7 years worth of history. So this says my oldest fiscal year set is 2018. And of course, it'll be fine with my 99 years, but even if I had 7, I wouldn't be losing that fiscal set. So this was just a reference, and I'll close that out. And now to run year end, I'm just going into GL periodic processing, and I'm selecting create new year. Reminder that we should have a backup done before we start. That it's going to create records for processing in 2014, close out our income and expense accounts, change the current year to 2024, and I must create a fiscal calendar in 2024 before I can proceed. So I've done each of those steps, so I'll say process. Now, you might often get this message and you think everybody's out. So you need to make sure that it's not you who's holding that up. If you have other windows that might be open, so let me find my Sage. I didn't think I had anything open. Found it. So it's an AP invoice batch listing that I did not close. So we'll go back to the create new year process and say process. Now, while I was looking for what might have been open, I also wanted to point out that some users might have a third-party add-on program that accesses Sage outside of the module itself. These might include an EDI program with an automatic link, or document management link, or notes from ORCID Manager. And so there might be a tray icon that you need to close in order to get exclusive access. You can see here that it went across to all accounts, closing them out to retained earnings if they were an income or expense account. And it tells me that my year has been created and that that batch has been created in the GL. So if I wanted to, I could start processing, but it's not a bad habit to go into GL setup again, just go back to options. And although that message was very clear that it created it, sometimes it's just a peace of mind to make sure that this current fiscal year is 2024. So now that that is done, we're moving into the last phase. And so we can go into General Ledger now, GL transactions, that batch list, and go ahead and create and post our batches from the subledger that had an error batch in them. So that is now completed. We'll just go back to our PowerPoint presentation. So following the retained earnings, we can post our batches into period 1 in the GL. So post all your error batches. And if you had automatic reversals on your accrual batches, those would also have created an error batch for you. So you want to post those into period 1. And now you can post your journal entries into period 1 as well. If you need to post to the previous years, then you can go into settings and make sure in GL options where we were earlier that you can post to a previous year. When you're posting to a previous year, you just use the previous year date as the posting date. So you can do these for any correction entries or an entry that was missed, but also for adjusting entries that come from your accountants or the auditors. And you can post those to period 12 or to a period called ADJ. In Sage 300, it allows you to post to um, a period ADJ so that um, you could reprint your trial balance for period 12 just as it was without any adjustment entry. So just as it was at period end. Then you could reprint the report as of the period ADJ, and it would allow you to then um, see those adjusted entries as long with period 12. And then to print showing that we do not um, have any entries in period 12 with the balances, but actually to show the closeout to retained earnings, you select the period CLS. That allows you to review any updated retained earnings and have the report print zeros in your income and expense accounts. And just as a reminder, if you do post back to a previous year, Sage will automatically create the required closing entries. So I just have a few useful functions that I wanted to point out at year end. There is a post all button on GL. So in the GL batch listing, when I was closing out or posting my single error batch for the new year, it was okay just to post one at a time, but I could have selected to say yes to post and then use the post all button to quickly post all error batches. If you aren't comfortable using those error batches, you can temporarily change the GL integration settings. So somebody who has rights to update the settings in the subledger, you could go into the GL integration and change that from automatically post a batch to just create the batch. And then those batches would remain open, but not create an error. And once you've posted those batches, you can go back in to the GL integration settings and turn on the automatic post. Also, remember that you can go into the GL listing report and print that across for multiple fiscal years. I wanted to, just before we get to questions, I wanted to go to point out that there is a year-end close in the subledgers themselves. So this session we talked about closing out in the GL. There is a close in those subledgers, accounts payable and accounts receivable. You would use this to reset the average day to pay counter. So that's in statistics. And also there's a statistics that has the highest balance this year, the highest balance last year. Those don't automatically roll over. You need to go into the periodic processing year-end function in order to reset those balances and move the highest balance this year into highest balance last year. You can also use that function to clear any recurring payables or recurring receivables statistics. If you're using that, do not reset your batch numbers. Don't select that option at all. That would eliminate the ability to drill down from the GL or to open up any batches again to look at them. That was a requirement and a carryover from DOS days where disk space was limited, but now we want to keep our history and be able to look them up. And that also means there's no longer a need to reprint or save reports because we can always look those up again. Some other functions that you might find helpful in the main menu under help, there's an ability to view the current users so you can see who's in the system. If you log in as the admin user, you can force or kick out selected users. So as I mentioned, you needed exclusive access and maybe somebody left and didn't sign out of Sage. The admin user will allow you to select those users and kick them out. And just a reminder that you want to check your system tray for any hidden access, such as that ORCID systems tray, if you're using notes or document management link, or another link from something like EDI. And in administrative services, there is a function that's available called database dump. That wording, database dump, is really our backup from inside of Sage 300. With regards to clearing history, just remember that there is a difference between clearing history in the GL and clearing history in subledgers.